First, on behalf of the Center for Ethics, Law and Applied Philosophy, I would like to thank you all for coming. I'm grateful to Natasha Jankovic and Aleksandar Pušić who were assisting us in organizing the conference. Even though the idea for the conference that would join architects and philosophers was mine, and initially Francesco Vitale, Maurizio Ferraris and I wanted to hold this conference in Naples or in Torino, its realization would not have been possible without Marguerite Derrida. She is with us today, who recommended me to Jeff Kipnis, Jacques Derrida's friend and architect. Kipnis animated most of the participants here to attend, and it is thanks to his generosity that we have such distinguished guests. My special thanks go to Catherine Ingram and Mark Cousins for agreeing to come. On behalf of Jean-Luc Nancy, who himself was unable to join us, I invited Chris Younes. We will not have Peter Eisenman during the discussions, but Kipnis will moderate a conversation with him via Skype starting tomorrow at 6 p.m. Let me remind you again. Today, sorry. On September 17, 1985, 27 years ago, Peter Eisenman organized a meeting with Jacques Derrida, Jeffrey Kipnis, Renato Rizzi, who is here. I forget the name of the fourth guy. This meeting, the first in series of working meetings on the project Choral Work, collaboration that Derrida labeled neither collaboration nor an exchange, but rather a double parasitic laziness, was preceded by an event in the spring of 1985. Bernard Tschumi, who will address us here tomorrow and in Polaris the day after, no, today and in Polaris the day after, while working on La Villette, was the first who invited a philosopher with whom to collaborate. That person was Jacques Derrida. Two events followed and from 1988, both concerning the philosopher and architect Mark Wigley, who is our opening speaker today. The first event was an exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in New York from June 23rd to August 13th, Deconstructivist Architecture, with Mark Wigley as the associate curator and lecturer at Princeton University, writing the text for the exhibit catalog. In this text, bearing the same title as the exhibit, he insists that form has become contaminated, that the 7 architects associated with the term deconstructivist share striking formal similarities, and that they intentionally violate the cubes and right angles of modernism. The second event, no less important, is Mark Wigley's book, The Architecture of Deconstruction, quite possibly one of the best books written about Derrida and of particular interest to philosophers. I think we can put aside all that is useful for philosophy and philosophers coming out of the encounter of Derrida and various architects. I would only like to mention that without these events, the thematization of the institution, for example, what is institutional, what is counter-institution, that Derrida developed after meeting Eisenman and his visit at Columbia in 1992, where Wigley and Tschumi were his hosts, would not have happened. Further, it is after Derrida's encounter with these deconstructivist architects, with Libeskind, for example, Derrida became aware of the importance of the political. And I do not think that there would have been a connection with architecture had it not been for Eisenman's important letter to Derrida a reply to Jacques Derrida, that was the name of the letter, in which in 4 brief pages Derrida's work is criticized better than ever before. The relation of presence-absence, Eisenman introduced the term resentness. He points to the lack of real and concrete in Derrida's reading, or more precisely, that what is missing is reading in the event of a building. Without all of this conversation with architects, that would have been no thematization of the term deconstruction. We ought to be very careful about using this term, who is owning it and who is disowning it. In the late 90s, both Eisenman and Derrida hesitate and reject deconstruction, while later in his life Derrida accepts and explains it more and more. Here are 3 sentences on deconstruction by Peter Eisenman. In an interview with Charles James in 1988, quote, "I want to correct your phrase, deconstructionist work. I am not certain that my work is deconstructionist. It is possible to read my early work in the way you seem to be saying, even though I do not think it was clear to me then that that's what I was doing." In a 1989 interview for the Spanish magazine Arquitectura, he said, "I never talk about deconstruction. Other people use the word because they are not architects." In a 2004 interview with Robert Locke, "I would consider to be a disciplinary specificity to architecture, so that even though the deconstructionists say that everything is one, and there is an intertextuality, and that there is no subject, I believe there is a subject, I believe there is a disciplinary specificity to all disciplines, and what I believe one is looking to do, in addition to anything else, is find what that disciplinary specificity is in architecture." End quote. I would like to emphasize 2 more facts and to briefly explain the goal of this conference that I want to defend here today. After reading various texts and interviews explaining the figure of deconstruction and the position of Eisenman and Derrida or Tschumi or Kipnis, Wrigley or the other guys. The goal is quite simple. Jacques Derrida, or the philosopher or philosophy, called or invited upon by Tschumi or Eisenman, that is, the call to collaboration between architecture and philosophy, is not the most important thing, and this collaboration has in one way or another missed its mark. We tried to express this position in the subtitle, The Spectre of Jacques Derrida, just like, if you will, the exhibit text from 1988 does not mention Derrida anywhere, but rather he functions as a spectre or haunt. The title of the exhibit came about because the MoMA would not allow the organizers to use the title Violated Perfection. That was original title of the exhibition, Violated Perfection. Besides, the deconstruction that Wrigley and Johnson reference to does not refer to theory in their own words, but an architectural tradition and the history of architecture. Thus, the call to a philosopher, in this case Derrida, is really an attempt to wake the philosophers in the architect, for the architect to finally thematize and explain his work, the political and sociological consequences of his engagement, and become a philosopher and incorporate the philosopher within himself. To still think deconstruction or to think the architecture of deconstruction is perhaps the last call to architects to adopt philosophy and the thematization of their own work, or the last affirmation that there is in fact no difference between the architect and the philosopher. Of course, the architect will necessarily have to answer some complicated questions. One question is still relevant, and Derrida mentions it in an unpublished discussion with Kupp Himmelblau from 1988, which can be found in Derrida's archive in Irvine, and is entitled Un entretien impossible, impossible interview. I thank Marguerite Derrida for allowing me to quote it. This interview spells out clearly what Derrida is trying to tell Eisenman in a letter from October 12th, 1989, speaking of Benjamin, poverty, and homelessness. I quote, "During the lectures I gave in Japan, I insisted that the best contemporary architects, the most audacious, the most inventive, no longer place importance on social and political problems such as question of housing, and they are right to do so. What they are doing is more formal, more formalist. Sometimes even the architects associated with deconstruction, and I say, all right, I understand why you sometimes do not wish to follow, for example, political regulations, housing commissions, which say things like, well, you should design low income housing, something for the homeless, socially useful, etc. All right, because this implies to use of all architectural schemes, and you are right, you should not have to do it. However, you should attempt to become more political in new way. You should pay attention to investment sources in the ways in which your investments are used or exploited, so to speak. How come it is possible to design deconstruction architecture in Japan, in Los Angeles, and maybe in Berlin, and not in Central Africa? What are the new ties with capitalism? I think that we need a new analysis and not one based on old patterns of this new architecture. Please now welcome Jeff Gibbons.